home and they say, I got a good grade, and they call up their friend and say, what grade did you get? And they said, well, I got a 90. And they go, but you did just as good as I did. And now their 85 isn't feeling so good anymore because they're comparing themselves with someone who got a higher grade, and therefore we're less happy. Now we should be the same. We should have the same amount of happiness, right? We liked 85 before. We should like 85 right now. It's the same grade. It gives us the same thing. But finding out that someone got a higher grade makes what we have look worse. Another example we're given goods is that if you have one item that is the biggest part of your budget, it might displace other people. So if food or rent is the biggest part of your budget, you might spend more for an inferior product. And what's really behind all of this is this idea of positionality or status, that having certain things confers status. Why do people go to private school? It's not because necessarily the education is better. A lot of it has to do with the idea that I'm going to this or that school, and that school has a name. Why do people spend a lot of money for expensive doctors for very simple procedures when someone who makes a lot less money might be just as good? Now, the problem for society is that this is kind of socially sanctioned masochism, which means that we're not getting more value out of something, but we're paying a higher price. And we're wasting a lot of resources by paying a higher price on inefficiently, because we're not getting more value for our money, we're getting less value. And that's not good for society, because a lot of resources are wasted just by signaling that we're number one and someone else isn't. We're putting exchange values, the price that we put on these commodities, and not thinking about how useful they are. And that's probably not a good way to run society. So now we come to our last model, and we've learned about elasticities. And what these models are, these cobweb models, are about the relative slopes of the supply and demand curve, or most specifically, the long run supply and demand curves. So on the left-hand side, we have a situation where the slope of the supply curve, in absolute terms, is greater than the slope of the demand curve. You can see the demand curve is relatively flat, and the supply curve is not as flat. And what happens is you get an inward spiral to price stability. So for example, if, supply changes, i.e. if you have coffee and all of a sudden there was a famine or a rainstorm and the coffee supply was destroyed, well, it'll act like the rocking horse. It will bring it back to the center. Eventually you'll come back to stability. The prices will kind of spiral into the center. But if you have a situation where the demand curve is relatively steep and the supply curve is relatively an easy slope, and you presume that, let's say, you have the same kind of shock to the system, what you do is you'll get a spiral outward, which means you get bigger and bigger shifts in price. Now, it might be spiraling around the same, let's say, central tendency, but the deviations become larger and larger over time, and eventually you could say they leave orbit. Now, if the slope of supply is less than the slope of demand, you get this outward spiral in prices. And the reason why this occurs is because there's a time lag between when supply decisions and when demand decisions are made. Now, the best example of this is agriculture, because you have to, let's say, make your decisions or your expenses come up front, right? I have to spend for fertilizer and seeds and labor and all the other things. I have to make all those decisions, like, say, in February, March, or April, at the beginning of the growing season. But I don't get any benefit until the fall, right, when I harvest. And things might change between the spring and the fall, and as a result, there might be a difference between where the supply and demand curves are in the spring and the fall. And so what you might do is get fluctuations in prices, and these fluctuations can be stabilizing, meaning creating an inward spiral back to the equilibrium point where the long run supply and demand curve cross, or they could spiral outward, which means that they'll change even more. Another example are labor markets. The cost of your education is very, very high. I have to pay for my education up front, even before anyone gives me an offer of a job. only later on. Well, for example, I might become a doctor because I think, oh, doctors are making a lot of money. There's a shortage of doctors. There's a shortage of nurses. And so let me become a doctor or a nurse. But by the time I finish my training, okay, there's no more shortage, which means no one's going to pay me as much money, and there might not be a job there waiting for me. There's a gap between when I have to actually pay out to make the investment in these skills and services and the compensation that comes from them. Another example are stock markets, where let's say there's a technology, for example. I have to make the investment in this new technology up front, and the stock return is sometime in the future. And so you might get larger and larger deviations. Now basically what those spirals are like the unit circle. And if you took the unit circle and you stretch it out over, let's say, another dimension like time, you would get something like a sine curve. Now when it's inwardly spiraling, you're going to get this cone where the deviations decrease over time. Now they deviate around the same long-term price, but the fluctuations don't go up and down as much, right? They become less and less over time. This is a little bit like the rocking horse, where the rocking horse, the first time you thwack it, okay, it might shake back and forth relatively wildly, but over time the oscillations decrease until basically it's at a rest again. Now, if you believe in something like the disco model, or let's say the corridor model, you might get, say, bigger and bigger fluctuations over time, which means the long run equilibrium is still kind of in the middle, but the highs and lows are just really, really extreme, and they're getting more extreme over time. So this is like, for example, driving in a car without shock absorbers. Now, when you hit you're driving your car and you hit a pothole, right, the car shakes, but then eventually the car stabilizes and eventually you don't feel any vibrations anymore. If you were, let's say, riding, let's say, in a hayride and you hit the same pothole, the thing might shake a lot. And in fact, the shaking might increase and increase until, let's say, it completely, let's say, overturns, because the stability is quite low. Same thing might happen with, let's say, a heart pattern. Okay, you might have an arrhythmia where the palpitations kind of go up and down and they're violent, and that makes it more and more difficult. So what you do is you have the same long-run equilibrium, but greater, let's say, vibrations over a period of time. Now I want to make two final points, and this is a little bit about, we'll get more into this later when we talk about monopolies, but another way to read the supply and demand curve is these things called the consumer surplus and the producer surplus. And so if you look at the supply and demand curve and you kind of, let's say, have these ascending and descending lines, the equilibrium price is where these lines cross. So we can draw a line out from that to the x and the y axes. Now, the top is called the consumer surplus, and that's the difference between what I would have paid for something and the price I had to pay for it. So, for example, I like to buy books, and sometimes, the books, I look at Amazon, I find what the price is, and sometimes my value is a lot more than what they're going to charge me. And that difference, my value minus their cost of their price that they're going to charge me for it, is like a surplus, right? I'm getting something for free. I'm getting more happiness out of this than what they're actually charging me for. And that's what's called the consumer surplus. And that's kind of this triangle up here between the demand curve and a line created by the equilibrium price drawn to the y-axis. Okay? And the other thing is a producer surplus, which means that the supply curve basically tells you what things cost. But because there's a price above that, some people who are making this are going to make a profit. Well, and the other way to say a producer surplus is these are the profits. This is, let's say, your revenues, which are determined by the price you sell it at, minus the costs, and the difference is the profit, or the area is called the producer surplus. And you can figure that out by looking at the supply and demand curve like so. Now, one other thing here is that in a capitalist competitive market economy, there should be no consumer and no producer surplus, because guess what? It gets competed away. If there was a surplus, someone else will sell it for, let's say, a lower price, scale your business, okay, and let's say reduce the amount of profit being made. And the thing about a competitive market economy, the assumption is that there should be the reason why it's efficient, the reason why we think it's such a great thing to be in a competitive market economy is because no one is gouging us, which means there should be no long-term profits, because if there are, they're being competed away. So the point is, we often say profits is a sign of how good the system is, but in fact profits are a sign that the system is a little either A, rigged, most likely, or B, that it's not really operating that efficiently. Now, I just want to make the last point, which is just about inequality, and this is a little bit, has nothing to do with supply and demand, but just another way of visualizing data. And inequality is basically saying there's a disproportionate or unfair concentration of something we want, of something of value, income, jobs, grades, in one group. So for example, if the boys had most of the good grades or the girls had most of the good grades, we would say this is unequal in relation to gender, right? Something of value, grades, are concentrated unequally or unfairly in one group. Now the way we measure income inequality is by something called the Gini coefficient, and I'll explain that in a second. But basically this coefficient is the gap between a curve representing perfect equality and the actual Lorenz curve showing how much money people do have at different points in the income spectrum. So how rich are the rich and how poor are the poor. Now I will show you a graph on this, and you see the line going from 0 to 100 would be the perfect equality line, which means the first 1% families have 1% of the income. The 90% families cumulatively have 90% of the income. But these lines are always bowed out, as you can see here, income inequality and wealth inequality. And the Gini coefficient is kind of the distance between that straight perfect equality 45-degree angle line and the actual line of how rich the rich are compared to us and how poor the poor are. And this Gini coefficient can be either very close to the perfect equality line or relatively far away. Now another way of measuring it is basically looking at the distributions. Okay, and we've all seen distributions. We have the normal distribution, etc. Now another way, the normal distribution is basically another way of representing equality. And what a normal distribution is in technical terms is a leptokurtic homoscedastic distribution, or in layman's terms, where the mode is approximately the same as the mean, which is approximately the same as the median. Now inequality is where it's platykurtic, which means that it's relatively flat. It's heteroscedastic, which means that the two sides of the distribution are not equal to each other. And also that the mode is not equal to the median, or the mean is not equal to the median, which means there's skew, which means that most of the observations are to the north or south, or to the above or below the actual mean, and or that there's multiple modes. For example, instead of just having one little mountain in the center, or even one little mountain on the left-hand or right-hand side, you have many different, let's say, peaks, and each of these peaks represents a different mode. And the words we use for this is that it's called kurtosis. Kurtosis is, let's say, whether you have one mode or multiple modes. And skewness, whether the mean value relative to the median value. When the mean is greater than the median, it's skewed to the right, and when the mean is less than the median, it's skewed to the left. I just want you to have these ideas in the back of your head. They're not really related, but this is a good place to put them in.